Hello and welcome to a special Confluence webisode. The last time we were here, I said that we would be back when something interesting happens, and a few days hence, something interesting did happen. And to help us break down the sequence of the interesting events is Nicholas Michelon, partner at Confluence Consultants and founder-editor of Asia Power Watch. Welcome back, Nicholas. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you, Amandeep.
Great. So at the end of last year, in the Global Risk Monitor that Confluence Consultants had produced, we had mentioned that the busy election season in Africa was going to be an exciting series of events to observe just because of how fragile the nature of governance can be. But this past week, two elections have made clear exactly how fragile societies across the world are. Transformative election outcomes across Argentina and the Netherlands are likely to have lasting repercussions across society and economies. Now, in Argentina, far-right libertarian Javier Milei won the presidential election. His campaign was based on, to paraphrase Donald Trump, making Argentina great again, which was also incidentally what Trump said to him first thing upon hearing of his victory. The new president is skeptical of China, and he's hoping to reduce the distress in the economy of Argentina by relying more on the US dollar, relying more on the American economy, and eliminating the local central bank. In the Netherlands, on the other hand, the most controversial European politician who has been described as the Dutch Donald Trump, whose name is Geert Wilders, has been elected prime minister as well. Now, one thing that is obviously common between the two of them is that both of them seem to have some sort of comparison or ties with Donald Trump, who himself was elected back in 2016. So what is now becoming more prominent is that more and more right-wing politicians seems to be resurfacing. We've had Suella Braverman in the UK, who was, of course, recently removed from office. We have Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and now we've got these two brand new officials. So let's start with the foundational question here of why more and more far-right officials are coming into power, why this far-right sentiment is on the rise, and what do we think of the future of global politics with these right-wing sentiments coming into place?
Well, it's a very wide question, and I think first of all, and I'm going to try to keep it short on this, but we need to be very clear when it comes to what we mean by far right. Many of the names that you have mentioned, Amandeep, Milei, Trump, Wilders, Meloni, I would even add Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Putin in Russia, etc. Strong leaders, that's for sure. Far right, you do find a lot of differences between what they're advocating. Some of them come from very conservative backgrounds, which is not the case of Milei, for example. Milei is anything but conservative. He's really, as you said, a libertarian. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, by the way, he's not yet prime minister. He has won, his party has won the largest number of seats in parliament. Now it remains to be seen whether he will be able to have a coalition and then possibly be named prime minister. But Geert Wilders is also from a fairly libertarian background. Not quite conservative in the sense of religious conservatism, conservatism on society morals. Likes of Vladimir Putin or Narendra Modi are very conservative in that way. So what is interesting is that in the current world that we're living in, you have very different flavors of what I would call, and this is what I believe is the only common point that all those leaders have, different flavors of anti-globalist agenda. What those leaders have in mind is their criticism and their rejection of the postmodern globalist utopia, as they call it, and their willingness to go back to the nation as defined by a government by the people, for the people, with boundaries, with frontiers. This is, I believe, what is truly the common point. But when you've gone past that common point, you start having very different flavors. We could be talking also about some names that are coming to the forefront in countries but have not yet reached power. In France, Marine Le Pen. In Spain, Santiago Abascal of Vox, for example. Santiago Abascal is very conservative. If he ever gets to power, or someone from his party gets to power, it will be good old-fashioned conservatism. Marine Le Pen, on the other hand, very different in France. Never been very close to the church and to religious morals. She's much more talking about protecting the purchasing power of the middle class, protecting French identity, but not so much being, too concerned about pre-French Revolution type of identity. So you have a lot of varieties in that so-called far-right sphere.
Right. So do you also think that this leaning or this kind of inclination towards one side or the other, left or right, is very cyclical in nature? Do we believe that policies are put into place, an impact is felt, it doesn't quite work for everyone, and then the cycle changes again? So sort of if we think about the world wars, for example, prior policies didn't work, Hitler tried to change it in Germany, and then that cycle kind of came back. So do we think that there's a cyclical nature to these inclinations?
I do agree. I tend to think that it's kind of the pendulum going back in the different, in the opposite direction now. This does remind me of a book written by the American economist Joseph Stiglitz, called Globalization and Its Discontents. I think what we are seeing here and what we are describing in this podcast is precisely this, the expression of this massive discontent towards globalization as it was reigning after the collapse of the Soviet Union up until the Trump administration. It looks like many people across the world, and it's interesting to see that this seems to be transcending whether you are a citizen of a post-industrialized economy or a developing economy, Northern Hemisphere or Southern Hemisphere, OECD country or Global South, non-OECD. There seems to be a common discontent towards what globalization has been delivering. And we are seeing now some populations being willing to take fairly radical chances when it comes to electing new people in power. I mean, Javier Milei in Argentina, it's a fairly risky bet for Argentinians. We will get back to this later. Geert Wilders, I mean, he's seen with a pair of scissors cutting off the European flag and removing one of the stars of European flag. So sending the message that should he get to power, he will propose a referendum on what they call in the Netherlands an Netherlands exit from the EU. So populations are now so concerned and so fed up with the unfulfilled promises of the globalist agenda that they are willing to trust some extremely radical politicians who are promising basically to move back on many of the latest developments. So it remains to be seen whether it will pan out. Some of them are proposing extremely radical agendas that may be very difficult to deliver on, but it shows the level of discontent and it shows the level of fed-upism, if I may call it that.
Yeah, it's interesting because in one of our previous podcasts as well, this came up that ever since Brexit, it seems like the European experiment for this sort of collaboration, if you will, the fact that a referendum was held is probably the biggest failure in the face of the European Union. And now that that has happened, people can see that removing yourself from a union like that is possible, has now prompted other states to think about it as well. And it's the same with war as well. When one faction goes into war, others find the vulnerabilities in the system and then they play those to their advantage and launch their own attacks. So do we also now think that perhaps we can't quite map out a future when it comes to these sort of policies or these sort of politicians coming into power, that it is that pendulum, like you said. So, today it's right wing, tomorrow it could easily be left wing or centrist. So do we think that, let's say until 2050, this sentiment is likely to continue? And then things are likely to change, just in terms of a future perspective for, let's start with Europe and then we'll get into Argentina.
Well, at least for Europe, I would give this right-wing wave more than 2 or 3 years to go. I do believe that it is a very profound wave, that it will continue to shape European politics, the more European nations turn back to conservatism or to right-wing policies, the more Brussels will try to push back. And it is basically one of those stories where, radicality in the political discourse calls for more radicality on the opposite side. Brussels is not relenting in its globalist agenda. If anything, it's actually trying to speed up that agenda even more, because they are realizing that indeed there could be an Italxit, an exit, maybe a Frexit or whatever. So they're trying to speed up on that agenda, which means that the populations are pushing back even more. And they are now also speeding up their giving access to very radical anti-EU leaders, giving them access to power. I mean, we haven't mentioned Denmark, but the political discourse in Denmark has changed completely when it comes to immigration. The political discourse in Sweden is starting to change radically when it comes to immigration as well. So there is massive pushback everywhere. In some countries, it's done in a much more abrupt way. Some countries have, I would say, a history of moving forward pretty violently. I mean, France is one. France has been moving forward throughout history through revolutions all the time. This is the way it's done here. In some countries, it's done in a much more subtle way. But I do believe that this right-wing wave, conservative wave, anti-globalist agenda wave has a lot of wind under its wings. And I do believe that it's going to last much longer than the next 2 or 3 years.
Right, just one final question before we move into Argentina. In the context of the conflict in the Middle East and this sort of anti-Islam sentiment going on in Europe, how do you think that is going to impact the pace at which more and more right-wing sentiment comes into play? So like you mentioned, Sweden has had radical change in its immigration ideology. How do we think this, against the backdrop of this conflict, how do we expect that to change?
Well, it is quite worrying because there is a total disconnect, and there's now an outright opposition, fundamental opposition between the general will of the populations, which is to put an end to uncontrolled immigration, mostly coming from Muslim countries and sub-Saharan African countries, and the agenda that keeps being pushed by Brussels and many of the national governments, which is to keep the borders open. And for that matter, I would like to remind listeners that it's not only EU countries that are concerned. Even in the UK, the Home Secretary, who has just been removed from office in the latest reshuffle of the Sunak government, she reminded that over the past 2 years, so we are post-Brexit, post-COVID, right in the middle of the world slowdown in economic cycle, post-COVID, over the past 2 years, the UK has welcomed the equivalent of the city of Birmingham as new immigrants over the past 2 years. So this kind of criticism is growing by the day. The conflict, the renewed conflict between Israel and Palestine is fueling these tensions in Europe. I mean, I am based in Paris, but I've seen the same happening in the streets of London, in many streets of German cities. Pro-Palestinian demonstrations, unfortunately, very often into full-blown anti-Semitic demonstrations with the shouts of gas them, burn them, kill them all, etc. It is very worrying. And the problem is that the populations in Western Europe, at least, are losing trust in their governments when it comes to tackling this problem. Last night, what happened in Dublin? Another stabbing spree in Dublin, followed by riots by Dubliners, basically demonstrating and rioting against what they consider as unchecked immigration. Again, so this disconnect is fueling even more distrust. And the problem is that when people stop trusting the governments, they start to resorting to their own policing and to their own justice, to their own brand of justice. And this is what makes people like me say that we are getting dangerously close to a situation in Western Europe where we are basically in a type of low intensity civil war type of situation, where communities are not standing side by side, but face to face now. It's becoming more and more apparent. And if governments do not do something quick about this, people will be doing justice themselves. People will be putting in power extremely radical politicians who promise them basically social peace, which is one of the main arguments right now. Whoever can promise social peace has a fairly good chance of making it to at least the second round of any election right now. So that's the question. Will Brussels listen to this, or will they actually accelerate their globalist agenda and basically act against the will of the European populations?
Low intensity civil war, I think, is a very good way to put it, because it always feels like Europe is on the brink of a civil war. There's always some kind of friction amongst communities. Doesn't quite get into the full-fledged war, thankfully. But yes, that's a very enlightening way of putting it. Moving towards Argentina, a special form of justice, or special form of revolution almost, to put things back into order. From an economics perspective, how successful do you think Argentina's dollarization route is likely to be?
Okay, to answer this question, I think we need to look at two aspects of what President-elect Javier Milei has been proposing, has been promising the Argentine people, which is dollarization of the economy. There is a purely macroeconomic aspect and a very technical aspect. And this is where it will be very difficult for President Milei to deliver fully on that promise. Obviously, the promise is for a country that has been struggling with more than 100% inflation and constant devaluation of its currency. The promise is, if we fully dollarize the economy, then at least we are erasing all possibility of importing inflation through our imports, and we are not at the mercy of currency exchange rate volatility anymore. So he's proposing to dollarize, he's proposing to abolish the central bank, which is possible. I mean, there are some countries out there who do not have a functioning central bank. The problem is that they are usually extremely small countries, like the Principality of Monaco, the Principality of Andorra, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. So how much can you learn from those economies, which are extremely particular in comparison to Argentina? The problem will be for Argentina, once you dollarize the economy, you are putting at risk, which was what was the main lifeline for Argentina to be able to repay, to service its national debt, which was the currency swap lines that Argentina had with China, especially with the People's Bank of China. The currency swap line is basically an agreement between two states through their central banks to exchange currencies at a predetermined exchange rate and a predetermined interest rate. A predetermined exchange rate was extremely favorable to Argentina, considering the latest volatility in its currency exchange rate. I have some numbers here. For the late 2023, the gross international reserves of Argentina stood at about 24 billion US dollars. And of those $24 billion in international reserves, almost 30% came in the form of currency swap lines with the People's Bank of China, of the PRC. Argentina activated about 6.5 billion of the 18 billion swap line that they have. If you go for full dollarization, you're putting at risk those swap lines, because then suddenly you have no more incentive. First of all, you've abolished the central bank, so who's going to be managing that swap line with the Chinese central bank, first of all? Second of all, you remove that incentive, but then how are you going to service your debt?
Yeah.
The swap line was the main way that Argentina, up until now, has been able to service its debt towards the IMF, for example. So you're putting that very capability of Argentina to remain as a more or less solvent country, you're removing that possibility. So that's the macroeconomic aspect of it. What is lurking behind that macroeconomic aspect, of course, is a geopolitical element.
Yeah.
And this totally fits within what Milei has been calling China, which is a criminal, if I believe, a criminal state at one point, a murderous state, sorry, led by communist, communist government, which he absolutely abhors. So the main argument behind the macroeconomic argument is actually the geopolitical argument. The fact that Milei, being a libertarian, wants to align Argentina firmly into the Western side, especially since he seems to be betting on the return to power of Donald Trump at the next election in 2024. So my argument would be also that the feasibility of the dollarization of the Argentinian economy will very much also depend, number one, as I said, on the capability to find another way to repay the debt, but very much depend on the fact that Donald Trump comes back to power or not, because he will need a godfather like Donald Trump to make that work. Already Brazil, which is the other member of BRICS, and we will be talking about BRICS later, I believe, already Brazil has gone back to a left-wing government with Lula coming back to power after Bolsonaro. So that puts Argentina in a very peculiar situation where he probably has promised much more than he can actually deliver, at least in the next few months.
Yeah. And I believe both Lula and Milei haven't had the best of conversations this week. They've had some nasty words said to each other. And that brings me to my next question. We've already spoken about how BRICS has been questioned for its foundation amongst countries who have, let's say, issues with each other. China and India, for example, the biggest economies within BRICS, cannot look eye to eye when it comes to border issues. Now we bring into this mix Argentina and Brazil, who are now not quite friendly. And so this really puts the foundation of this entire endeavor into a lot of question. Saudi and China, for example, have also had, well, not issues, but just kind of, back and forth on a lot of issues. So how successful do we think BRICS can prove to be when members aren't quite at their best yet in terms of cooperation with one another? And is it even possible for Argentina to say we're going to be a member and then retract from it before their membership has even begun?
It is for sure that BRICS is still an ensemble, a geopolitical ensemble that is very fluid. The borders are moving all the time. It's the beginning of a story. I think, to be fair, I've heard a lot of times that BRICS makes no sense. It has no spine, no political spine, no economic spine. I often remind the people who say that, would you say that the EU has a spine, apart from the euro? I mean, look at the variety of realities within the EU: fiscal reality, social reality, macroeconomic reality, industrial reality. So it is possible to have an ensemble that is made up of extremely different countries, sometimes with very divergent agendas. So that would be my first comment. My second comment would be Milei, in a way, seems to be going. It seems like he's announcing that he's probably going to behave a little bit like a Bolsonaro. Last time I checked, during the Bolsonaro administration, Brazil did not leave BRICS. And if people remember, the very first years of the Bolsonaro mandate, the relationships between Brazil and China were absolutely terrible, for obvious reasons. Bolsonaro was replaying the Trump scenario. Trump had just started his trade war against China. Bolsonaro was trying to basically walk on the same path. So the fact that Brazil did not leave BRICS, did not suspend its participation, the fact that after a couple of years, even the Bolsonaro administration started to warm up to Chinese ties because of a principle of realism. Who are we going to send? Who are we going to sell all the soybeans and the pork and the beef that we produce? Well, China is the main buyer. So we cannot afford to destroy that relationship. It's going to be the same issue for Argentina. On top of the issue we've discussed before, where Argentina needs that currency swap line that it has with China. And China is the only one that gives such a generous currency swap line. I mentioned the currency swap line given by China amounts to $18 billion. The Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks, only grants Argentina $3 billion of swap line. China grants them 18.
Wow.
So there will be a principle of realism that will dawn on Milei very fast, and let's
Mhm.
hope that it dawns on him extremely fast.
Mhm.
And he's going to have to wait until the end of 2024 to see if maybe Trump gets back to power. So
Yeah.
my take is that he's promised something very big. Yeah, it's chainsaw politics. You know, he was brandishing his chainsaw to say that I'm going to destroy the political establishment in Argentina. It's a little bit like what we saw in Colombia with Petro, the ex-guerrillero who became Colombian president, the first really left-wing Colombian president since the independence of Colombia. There are major differences between what he promised and what he actually had to deliver once he was in power. I mean, the principle of realism will dawn on them very fast. Now, to go back to BRICS, it is certainly a sign that the only thing that gets BRICS together at this stage, and it is a factor of weakness, it's this project of de-dollarizing the world economy. This is really, as we speak, especially since the renewed conflict between Israel and Palestine, which is creating a new rift between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are two members that are supposed to join BRICS very soon. This is the only thing that gets everybody together. And that's a fairly weak link. I mean, I'm not saying that the argument is weak. There is urgency to de-dollarize from the standpoint of these countries, but this is the only thing that gets them together. And it's very easy to influence an election like in Argentina when you are the US, and to make sure that the candidate that gets there is an anti-de-dollarization candidate. It is fairly easy. So still rough waters ahead of BRICS. I do believe that it's not going to have BRICS derail from its long-term goal, which is de-dollarization of global trade and of the members' economies. But it's going to take a while. There's going to be a lot of pushback from the US, definitely a lot of pushback. And I think the election of Milei must be seen as one expression of this pushback from the US dollar sphere. But I do not believe that it will derail because the principle of reality is still there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose also campaigning is always wildly different from the realities of post-election, what we see. So passions are probably speaking louder than potential actions. Great. Thank you very much, Nicholas, for breaking all of this down. I actually feel a lot calmer about the observations of this past week. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we hope to bring you some fresh updates and insights as soon as something interesting happens again, which will probably be next week now.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amandine. Thanks, Amandine. Bye-bye.